How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about static versus dynamic or DHCP addressing, right? And so the question as we go into or further into switching and routing and layer 2 and layer 3 conversations become, why can I simply go on my device in my home network, connect to the network, get an IP address, and not have to assign anything? Everything is basically handled for me. And why is that different on the OT side? And so today I wanted to briefly, obviously, explain static and dynamic or DHCP addresses, how they're created, and ultimately why that is usually not the case on the OT side. Thank you so much for watching our channel. If you have a moment, I would truly appreciate if you could subscribe and like the video. If you could also leave me a comment as to whether the content is interesting for you, or if you would like to see something else in manufacturing industrial automation. It helps us tailor some of the future videos. I will also mention that we have a ton of different tutorials and articles that go way beyond the content on the joltech.com website. If you need help on some of your projects, don't hesitate to reach out. With that in mind, let's get back to the video. So number one, static is what we have been doing in our labs. We have been going into hardware, we've been setting the parameters for the specific address, whether that's on the laptop, the VFD, or the PLC side. We've been setting the subnet mask, and that is basically what you would call static. Dynamic is going to be, as the name suggests, automating the process of assigning an IP address. And the way it usually works is I'm going to just refer back to the diagram that we had earlier in our conversation. And so the ISP is going to provide you with a router, modem, and access point that will have a set pool of addresses that can be dynamically assigned, right? So again, this device is going to look something like, if you have multiple ports, usually it's between 2 and 4 ports, where you can plug in, for example, your PCs, and then you're going to have, like I've illustrated a couple of times now, laptops, you're going to have cell phones and other devices that can connect over wireless, right? And I'm just oversimplifying the diagram a little bit, so let's assume that there's a desktop PC somewhere in your office, and again, maybe a lot of you are using just laptops, but basically you're going to wire in into this device, and in most cases, as we've configured our USB to Ethernet adapter, you don't have to go through that process. This is made to simplify the steps, and like I said, just assign an IP address based on a pool, right? So this device ultimately a lot of times is going to be at 192.168.1, let's say .1, and again, obviously it's going to depend on the settings, what the ISP provides, but let's assume that this is the IP address of this device. It's going to have a pool, right, as I keep saying. Let's call it 192.168.1.10 all the way to, again, let's say 200, right? So any of the devices can then be assigned. So for example, this is going to be 192.168.1.10. This one is going to be .11, and I'm only basically showing the last octet. This is going to be .12. .13, and they are assigned at random, right? So I'm just going to illustrate them in a sequential order, but you will see certain devices. So if you go into the management console of your device, and again, this is going to depend on the internet provider, but you can go and look at what devices are currently part of your home network in this case, and you can also configure this pool of devices, and you can make it more or less restrictive. Now, this is on the commercial or end user side, and so it makes it simpler for you to create these pools of devices, connect without having to choose an IP address. You can also, in most cases, set the IP addresses to be static, right? So in this case, our pool is .10 all the way to 200. So it is possible to create a pool of static IP addresses where you would assign, for example, this laptop, if you configure it to be 201, it's going to always be that specific address. Now, so the problem with this is that when you have dynamic addresses, if you, for example, turn off your laptop, and again, this is going to be remembered based on the MAC address of the device, you may get a different IP address next time you turn on and you connect to your device. This is not a problem for the consumer. If I'm connected to the ISP provider via whatever IP address, I'm still able to browse the web, view the videos, and basically go on with my day, send emails, whatever. On the industrial side, a lot of times, first of all, you do not have a server that is able to create the spool of addresses, so an unmanaged switch is incapable to do that. But second of all, you're going to have software that needs static IP addressing, right? And so what does that mean? Well, if you have a PLC and an HMI, in your PLC, you will specify the IP address of the HMI and vice versa. And this is simply because we can, in theory, have a server that's going to obfuscate the IP address with a name, right? And that's going to be your DNS server. And so in theory, I could create a DNS server that will say that this is equivalent to my modem. And this is equivalent, so for example, this is going to be my desktop 1. And usually you will have these nomenclatures and names inside of your computers on Windows, so that when you browse for those devices, you know that desktop 1 is going to be at a different IP address next time. This is not possible in OT. This is not something that we had as a feature, because once again, we don't typically have DNS servers that will assign some of those names or basically link the name to a specific IP address. Therefore, we always, or almost always, I'm sure there's going to be exceptions to the rule, but in most cases we're using static IP addressing. So you're going to physically, or I guess manually, configure the device using whatever software of choice, or using, as I've shown you on the front panel of the VFD, you're going to set the IP address and you're going to set the subnet mask, and you're usually going to set the gateway. Now, there's no other explanation for that reasoning. Perhaps in 5, in maybe 10 years, we will get to a point where we can dynamically allocate some of those IP addresses. And I'm sure that if you funnel, for example, data into the cloud from your OT operations, there's probably a way to use different container names or different instance names or VM names to pass some of that information without having to specify static IP addresses. If you have any questions on that side, don't hesitate to reach out. But like I said, for the most part, you need to be capable and understanding how to set static IP addresses on most of the hardware you will be working on the OT side.